The parables of new cloth and new wineskins passage, Matthew 9 verses 16 to 17, Mark 2 verses 21 to 22, Luke 5 verses 36 to 38 audience, John the Baptist's disciples context. John's disciples ask Jesus why the Pharisees fast, but his disciples do not. Key verse, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Matthew 9 verse 16. The first century religious establishment had expectations for the Messiah. In their understanding, he would come and build upon the traditions and practices of Judaism. Even John the Baptist's disciples didn't know how to understand why Jesus wasn't adhering to common Jewish observances. Jesus tells them that any attempt to patch up what was lacking in Judaism's traditional expressions of righteousness would only make everything worse. Like a piece of unshrunk cloth sewn into an old garment or a new wine in an old wineskin, Jesus was bringing something that wouldn't fit into the religious traditions of the time. The parable of the lampstand passage, Matthew 5 verses 14 to 16, Mark 4 verses 21 to 22, Luke 8 verse 16 audience, a great crowd context, the Sermon on the Mount key verse, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven, Matthew 5 verse 16. First century homes in Palestine were modest, and it didn't take much light to illuminate them. People used very small oil lamps which could easily fit under a small bowl. But the idea of lighting a lamp and putting it under a bowl is absurd. Not only would it be a waste of light, but it would also be a waste of oil. Like a lamp, followers of Jesus should be put in a place of prominence where the light within them can be seen clearly. The parable of the wise and foolish builders passage, Matthew 7 verses 24 to 27, Luke 6 verses 47 to 49 audience, a great crowd context, the Sermon on the Mount key verse, therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock, Matthew 7 verse 24. Hearing Jesus' words and putting them into practice is like building your home on a solid and trustworthy foundation that can withstand life's storms. Jesus contrasts that to the dangers of ignoring his words, which he compares to building one's life on sand. This would have been a shocking statement to people listening to Christ's sermon because they believed the Torah was the most reliable foundation to build one's life upon. The parable of the sower passage, Matthew 13 verses 3 to 23, Mark 4 verses 3 to 20, Luke 8 verses 5 to 15 audience, large crowd context, Jesus teaching beside a lake key verse, but the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop, yielding 100, 60 or 30 times what was sown, Matthew 13 verse 23. In the parable of the sower, Jesus uses the image of various kinds of soil to contrast different heart responses to the gospel, the path, hard ground where the enemy snatches away the seed of the gospel before it has a chance to take root. Rocky places, soil that is too shallow for the root of faith to survive. Thorns, soil where there are too many allegiances vying for space. Good soil, ground where the gospel can take root, flourish, and reproduce. Jesus' point in this parable is that how we receive the gospel is primarily determined by the condition of our heart. The parable of the weeds passage, Matthew 13 verses 24 to 30, 36 to 43 audience, large crowd context, Jesus teaching beside a lake key verses, no, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn, Matthew 13 verses 29 to 30. Darnel is a weed that mimics wheat. In its younger stages, it's virtually indistinguishable from this vital crop. As it grows, its roots intertwine with the wheat and make it difficult to uproot without losing the grain, too. If a rival farmer wanted to hamstring another, he would come and sow darnel in another's field. Jesus uses this word picture to communicate the dangers of judging whether someone else is a member of God's kingdom. At the end of the age, it will be God who sorts out the weeds from the wheat. The parable of the mustard seed passage, Matthew 13 verses 31 to 32, Mark 4 verses 30 to 32, Luke 13 verses 18 to 19 audience, large crowd context, Jesus teaching beside a lake key verse, though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. Matthew 13 verse 32. The kingdom of God would come from inauspicious beginnings and change the world. Even our calendar is determined by Jesus' coming. Jesus prophesied that this would be the case when he contrasted the kingdom of God with a mustard seed that starts small and grows into a tree capable of providing shelter. The parable of the leaven passage, Matthew 13 verse 33, Luke 13 verses 20 to 21. Audience, large crowd. Context, Jesus teaching beside a lake. Key verse, he told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Matthew 13 verse 33. In the parable of the mustard seed, Jesus explains that the kingdom of God would start small and grow immensely. In the parable of the leaven, he describes how that will happen. Like yeast working its way through the dough, the kingdom of God would flourish as it worked its way through cultures by traveling from individual to individual. The parables of the hidden treasure and the pearl passage, Matthew 13 verses 44 to 46. Audience, the disciples. Context, then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him. Matthew 13 verse 36. Key verse, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Matthew 13 verses 44 to 46. These two parables share the same point. They express the value of God's kingdom by illustrating what we should be willing to give up to acquire it. In both of these parables, the kingdom is portrayed as valuable enough to warrant giving up everything to possess it. The parable of the net passage, Matthew 13 verses 47 to 50. Audience, the disciples. Context, then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him. Matthew 13 verse 36. Key verse, when it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. Matthew 13 verse 48. This parable is similar to the parable of the weeds. It has to do with the coming judgment at the end of the age. As the gospel is spread throughout the world, it attracts all sorts of people, some who are willing to take it seriously and others who are merely drawn to elements of the message. A time is coming when the real disciples will be separated from the false ones in the same way that fishermen would separate edible fish from inedible or unclean ones. The parable of the homeowner passage, Matthew 13 verse 52. Audience, the disciples. Context, then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him. Matthew 13 verse 36. Key verse, he said to them, therefore every teacher of the law who has become a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Matthew 13 verse 52. Throughout the Old Testament, we see foreshadowings of Jesus' ministry. Teachers of the law who chose to follow Jesus played a valuable role in the early church, helping to illuminate the connection between the teachings and prophecies of the Old Testament and Christ's new covenant. Paul does this masterfully throughout the epistles.